with our distinguished professor of history and science, Gregory. Last week, we learned that Edward Teller had gotten his nuclear weapon. And the Russians, with some help from a physicist spy named Klaus Fuchs, and a team of really smart physicists, Russian physicists, quickly followed suit. So now we're at a point where two superpowers had began building enough nuclear weapons, thermonuclear weapons, to arguably capable of mutual annihilation. And so we are now going to follow Fred through how we have so far threaded that needle. Please go ahead, Fred.
Okay, thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm going to try and share the screen here, and that's always a bit of an adventure. Let's see here. Got to move this down a little bit. There we go. All right. I want to ask for your patience this morning. We're talking, this is lecture 4, and we're going to be looking at how the nuclear age began to spread to the public and to the literary world. I'm going to be doing, the patience request is because I'm going to try to do a bunch of technological maneuvers here, and I'm not the best at that. So we may need, for example, if I hit a YouTube thing, it may require us to sit through an ad. Now, I've tried to avoid that, but I don't guarantee that we will. So I'll try to get rid of the ad as soon as possible, but just know that might happen, okay? All right, so what we know about the history of, let's just call it nuclear things, as far as it gets to the public, there isn't a lot that the public understands about quantum theory and all the rest of that. There still isn't, but certainly at the time there wasn't. They did know a bit about Einstein, of course, and they knew about relativity to a degree, but about nuclear stuff, they didn't know a whole lot. But in the mid-1920s, a number of young women who were employed by a company called US Radium in New Jersey began getting sick from painting radium dials on watches. And the press highlighted the plight of these women in articles that captured the public's attention. Women awaiting death tell how radium poison slowly kills. And these companies began to be the target of lawsuits. And of course, they didn't like the idea that this was, because they didn't know, nobody else knew exactly what the dangers of radium were, but they knew these women are getting sick and they're claiming that it was their fault. And of course, the companies resisted that. And they didn't always use the best tactics in resisting it. They finally settled out of court because it was undeniable that a disproportionate number of women were becoming ill in New Jersey. But then there was another company in Illinois, which was also sued, and they resisted too. And although the evidence seemed to be staring everybody in the face, that one went through 8 appeals before it was finally settled in 1939. Well, in the years after World War I, the general public only gradually became aware of atomic radiation from radioactivity. These are the women painting the dials. And you can see that what they would do is they would have this substance next to them. They would dip their brush in it and paint the dial. But then in order to get precision, they would lick the brush with their mouth and then put it in again. And they kept doing this all day long. So they were ingesting radium to a certain extent. So this looks like a duplicate slide that I didn't get out, but at any rate, we can get through it. This is the story of that. Now, this is not literary product from the time. This is a movie that's not that recent or not that long ago. It's in 1920 or in 2020. And let me see if I can give you a feel for it with the trailer, if my YouTube goes. here. Here's the ad I worried about.
Dr. Gregory, we cannot see the YouTube video thing.
Pardon me?
We can still only see the PowerPoint slide that says Radium Girls.
I see. Okay, so you're not getting that.
Correct. So if
Oh,
if you stop sharing the PowerPoint screen, if you do stop sharing screen,
yeah,
and then you'll click the share screen button again, and it'll say like, which one do you want to do? You can click on that YouTube window now, and then you should be able to share that.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if we can get to it. This one. No, that's the PowerPoint. This one. That's YouTube, all right, but we're not. Let's see if this is gonna. Are you getting that? Does everybody see
Welcome
that?
to American Radium. You're paid 1 cent per dial.
All I'm seeing is like a white screen.
Looks like
Oh,
a
there it
fat
goes.
tongue.
You're good. No, there it goes now.
Okay.
Josephine Cavallo.
Will you help me practice my feeling spaces? I'm studying. I have to be ready to be discovered and go to Hollywood. I want to find a tomb like Tux, but I'm an archaeologist. Joe, will you be ready in 5 minutes? Joe? Don't come in, please. Joe? I don't know what's wrong with her. I'm dizzy. My joints ache. I lost a tooth and 2 others are loose. Do you know what's wrong with me?
Absolutely nothing. You're healthy as a horse.
Where do you work?
American Radium.
Your dial painters. We believe that exposure to radium can cause devastating tissue damage.
Radium is good for you. Everyone knows that. What does this mean for us? You take American Radium down. There's a doctor that can test if your bones are radioactive. Bessie, you sound crazy. I'm not losing my job over this. I'm scared.
I'm not going back in there.
I'm looking for Bessie and Josephine Cavallo. They did a study. Here's her.
They own it.
Own research. That's absurd.
It's like owning gravity. American Radium is denying the harmful effects of radium.
All they have to do is run out the clock.
They could drag this out for years.
We don't have years.
You'll never win.
I'm doing it. No matter what.
You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. Everyone put down your brushes. Radium is poison. Bessie, you're trespassing. I won't abandon you.
They're trying to silence you. They must be stopped.
Really think you can beat American Radium?
I am going to make American Radium pay for what they've done. Get Joe out of here right now. We're gonna win.
All right. Now, let's see. Am I back, Lance, or am I not?
No, you gotta do the whole process again of, oh, okay, so
Alright.
now I don't see YouTube anymore. So now you just gotta share the PowerPoint screen again, and then we'll be back to seeing that.
All right, hang on just a second. This is really a gymnastic matter here. Okay.
Got it.
Can you see it? Am I back with the PowerPoint?
Looks good. We can see it.
All right. All right. Now, when I click on this, do I show you the full screen, or do you see? there. No. Now we're good, right?
We're good.
Okay. So as you can see there, they portray the situation as nobody thinking radium was bad or being unaware of the dangers. I think at some of the highest levels, certainly in the military, they were aware that radioactivity, in this case, we're talking about radioactivity, was and radiation in general was not safe. That is, you had to be careful with it. But science fiction at the time was aware of the possibility of science. That is, science fiction sometimes is a bit advanced ahead of what the developments of science is. And so some of the productions of these years was ahead of its time in that they talked about bombs. Here's a British diplomat, Harold Nicholson, who published a book called Public Faces in 1932. So this is after the first of those trials in the United States about radium and before the settlement of the second one. And in this one, we do have bombs being created from minerals in the Middle East that can be enormously powerful bombs, which science fiction could then create. And they cause a tsunami that permanently alters climate and kills 80,000 people. That was the novel. Now, Harold Nicholson was a British diplomat, pretty well known in his country, and he imagined that these bombs were being delivered by rockets. So the public was not, they didn't have, it wasn't that they had no clues, but they weren't really caught up with this so much because of the 30s were preoccupied with the Hitler's growing actions. First of all, he came to power in 33, and then the annexation of Austria in 1938, the Night of Broken Glass in November of 1938, and then the takeover of Czechoslovakia in the famous Harold, you know the guy I'm talking about, with the Peace in Our Time and appeasement, and then the non-aggression treaty with Russia in 1939, which surprised everybody that Russia and Germany were somehow going to agree to something. And then when the war began by the invasion of Poland in 1939 in September. So those events were much more on the minds of people and in the newspapers, etc. But of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor brought the US into the war in 1941. And the war with Germany was won. And in 1945 May, this is the signing of the peace agreement between between the Allies and Germany. The war with Japan is still going on. Let me get rid of that if it's on there. And most Americans were not aware of the new weapon that was being developed, but there were a limited number of people. Sometimes they were senators who didn't really know anything, but they heard rumors that there was something going on somewhere secretly. Some speculated about it. And that was science fiction authors in a journal called Astounding Science Fiction, because they were not dumb and they realized that Einstein's E equals mc squared meant that if you had a mass that was converted into energy, that would be an enormous amount of energy. And so there was talk, as you know, last time when we talked about Lord Rutherford saying anybody who's talking about getting this energy out of the nucleus is talking moonshine. Well, a science fiction writer doesn't have to worry about that, creates a story in which that's used. So we have stories with nuclear bombs that are appearing in the pages of Astounding Science Fiction in the 30s and in the early 40s. In fact, the March issue of 1944, in a story called Deadline, had a bomb that was enough like the one being created in Los Alamos that the editor was visited by the Army counterintelligence. So they are now watching very carefully what's out there that might disrupt the secrecy surrounding that Manhattan Project. So this is 1945, when Philip Wiley sold a story to Blue Book. It was about a Nazi attempt to rule the world with atomic bombs. Now, the War Department, monitoring this, objected, and the sale was canceled. Then Trinity, of course, took place in July of 45. That's the testing of the atomic bomb. And a note in Wiley's agent's files that same month indicates the reason why Wiley's book or article story in the Blue Book was canceled, because President Conant of Harvard is working on something similar. Well, Conant was involved in this whole thing. He wasn't a major player in Los Alamos or anything. But then with the dropping of Little Boy on Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945, now everybody knows there is something that is a super new weapon. And that signaled the end of World War II eventually. And of course, there was a second bomb, as we all know. Now, this is another thing. All right, Lance, I'm going to ask for your help again. I want to go here, and that you won't see. So I got to stop sharing and go back and share again. And here is what I want to share. I'm getting good at this. Don't be cocky, Fred. All right, can you guys?
What happened during the month of March will fundamentally reshape American.
All right, this is the ad.
On a very high note, and it ended with the economy just in complete tatters.
Is everybody seeing this?
A short time ago, an American airplane
You're good.
dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. We have spent more than $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and we have won. But the greatest marvel is not the size of the enterprise, its secrecy, or its cost, but the achievement of scientific brains in making it work. A short time ago, an American...
All right, no. Okay. Now, Truman was criticized for his decision, but was adamant that he made the right call. I'm going to skip this. It's an excerpt from Plain Speaking, which is a dramatization of that book. Harry Truman was a plain speaking person. And in it, there was just a short little clip that I wanted to show you, but it's too much trouble to make it worthwhile. Because he says he'd been criticized for doing it. He would do it in a minute because it saved 500,000 lives and the war would have dragged on. And so he didn't have any question that he had done the right thing. But it did take a while for the world to absorb the impact of the atomic bomb. Now everybody knows there is one, but they don't really know how it works. They only knew that it was a very powerful weapon. In fact, even the military didn't really grasp what it had on its hands. Kissinger, in his book on nuclear weapons and foreign policy, said, "We added the atomic bomb to our arsenal without integrating its implications into our thinking, because we knew it merely as another tool and a concept of warfare which knew no goal save total victory, no mode of war except all-out war." In other words, this was a qualitatively different kind of weapon. And we didn't really realize that it was qualitatively different than anything we had had up to that point. News coverage, of course, was all over the place, and they reported the devastation that was present in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the feeling grew that this was something that was very questionable. That is, it's a monster. They knew instinctively, the public, that if we'd figured it out, our enemies would. Here's what a young mother in New York said, who learned about the bomb just after giving birth to her second son. She reported being constantly in tears, haunted by the fleeting but torturing regrets that I have brought children into the world to face such a dreadful thing as this. And so you can see that this is really, really something that the public is beginning to wonder about, because it could come back to haunt them. And they knew that they were learning that there were large amounts of radioactive fallout that accompanied these bombs. So that was the situation when the dropping of an actual bomb was announced. The authors of fiction knew they were no longer writing about fiction. They were writing about something that was real. And I think there were three additional factors that changed the tone of these stories, even from what they were in amazing science fiction stories. And they are, first, the Soviets acquired the fission bomb by 1949. And then we moved it up a notch, and quite a bit of a notch, when we developed the hydrogen bomb tests of the 50s, and the Soviet Union joined us in those. And we both had fusion bombs, hydrogen bombs, in not too long a time. And then the onset of the Cold War, all of those things meant that the novels that were going to be written about this were going to be of a different tone from the ones that had been written up to that point. So Joe 1, that was the Soviet atomic bomb, was tested in August of 49, had the same yield as the second bomb, the one that went on Nagasaki. It was an implosion bomb. And the Soviets had gotten the plans that John already mentioned from Klaus Fuchs and Theodore Hall. The thermonuclear bombs soon followed for both the US and Soviets. And so that's the situation. Then we come to the tests of the thermonuclear bomb when again, this is not necessarily broadly discussed in the news. There are some people that know about it and report it, but it isn't something that gets a great deal of coverage because this happened in 52. Many of us, or most of us probably, were alive then. We were, at least in my case, I was still young, but, and I certainly wouldn't have paid attention to it, but the public didn't really know much about this either. There was a Japanese fishing boat that was caught in the radioactive fallout, and that became a story that people covered. And that's, of course, that fusion reaction that yields about 700 times more power in the hydrogen bomb than the atomic bomb. So if the first one had been a problem, the second one really was. Well, that means that the radioactive fallout's going to be a whole lot more. And so that's another dimension of things. It's no longer just about exploding bombs, but nuclear holocaust, the potential extinction of the human race, because we are in an arms race now. We're in an arms race with the Soviet Union. And you began to see maps about fallout from thermonuclear bombs, and you could find out where you were. This is becoming part of your life. And so that makes it more real. Probably many of us remember talk about fallout shelters, maybe even knew somebody that built one, or your folks built one. I remember talk about that. So now we begin to get Holocaust novels. They begin to dominate in the beginning of the 50s. The first one was Neville Shute's On the Beach, which I suspect many of you read. I read it when I was probably a junior in high school. And I remember one summer when I was reading it in the summer, and I remember I worked in the farm in the summer, and I remember being on the tractor. I don't know what I was doing, raking hay or something. And I took a lunch break, and I had that book, and I was sitting on a stone wall reading the book. And I remember feeling this weird feeling of being scared to death. This was a weird. That's about the people in Australia who were going to be the last ones to get the radiation, and they were going to die, and it was their story. Then in 1959, Alas, Babylon came out. That was a book that was set down, most people think, in Sanford, Florida, in that area. And it's about the survivors in Florida of a megaton bomb that destroyed Tampa and a bunch of other places. And then there's The Canticle for Leibowitz. That's an interesting book. It's a book that what it does is to have a World War III, and it starts with that. And this is the aftermath of World War III. But the only people who preserved the scientific information that preserved the technical knowledge about nuclear reactions were a group of priests. They were the ones that wrote it down like monks did of old, right? And they preserved this knowledge. Well, of course, it eventually gets reborn and the world faces another one. So another nuclear holocaust. There's a lot of this, and I don't know now here. Does everybody see that? I don't know that they do. Yes? Can anybody, Lance, can you tell me?
We can still just see the PowerPoint. You're gonna have to do the whole rigmarole again.
Okay. Well, what I've got in front of me, yeah, that's that. Thanks. I didn't anticipate this. That what I've got there is a list of Holocaust fiction books, and there is a lot of them. And so, if anybody ever wants that list, I can send it to you. It's just a website. All right. Well, let's go on here then. Now, obviously, these novels were followed close by movies, and I bet a number of you have seen On the Beach, perhaps. Gregory Peck, and was that Ava Gardner? I don't remember which the stars were. But this is the one that captured a lot of people's attention. This was, I'm not sure, who was that Kubrick? At any rate, it's a movie from the 60s, and I'm gonna go to it from my computer if I can get there. No, hang on. And then I've got to stop sharing. Hang on just a second. I'm going to try and show you a trailer from that movie, which will remind a lot of you.
Captain Mandrake speaking.
Listen to me carefully. The base is being put on condition red.
Jolly good idea. I'll keep your men on their toes.
Group Captain, I'm afraid this is not an exercise.
Hell.
It appears that the order
Very
called
hard to.
for the planes to attack their targets inside Russia.
Well, I guess I'm going to have to
This man
abandon.
is obviously a
I'm
psychotic.
seeing this and you're not. There we go. So at any rate, if you remember that film, it's a combination of comedy and black comedy. It's making fun of a very serious matter, and it's allowing people to absorb that through the means of comedy. And that one was followed by Failsafe. This one is another one, and I wish I could play these. Obviously, I didn't realize all the stuff that was going on here to do this. So Failsafe, if you remember it, was that's Henry Fonda and Walter Matthau, and that's a novel that became a movie, and the movie was very dramatic. It involved planes they're constantly in the air. These nuclear bombers are constantly in the air, and they may still be for all I know. And what happens, they have orders that are sealed, and they don't have to do anything. Most of their days would be spent just going up and flying around. But if they did get a communication, they would be ordered to their fail-safe point, which means they would go to a point that was pre-designated, and presumably that would involve Russia, because the Cold War here was with Russia. And so they would go to the fail-safe point, which is kind of like a launching point, and then they would open their orders, and their orders would tell them what their bombing mission would be. And in the film, you follow the plane that's ordered to the fail-safe point, and it's all a mistake because something had happened that caused this thing to be a mistake. And so Henry Fonda and the Russian premier are on the phone trying to discuss what to do. And they don't know how to stop it, because these flyers have been told to ignore, after you go to the fail-safe point and you open your orders, then you do what it says, and you do not listen to any communication in the aftermath. And of course, they're in this situation now where they're flying toward Moscow and are going to drop a bomb on Moscow. And Henry Fonda and the Russian premier are they end up trying to get our own planes to shoot them down. And of course, one of these planes gets through, and you follow that one. And basically, it does get through. And it drops the bomb on Moscow, and Henry Fonda talks with the Soviet premier until he hears the high-pitched whine on the phone line. And then they have agreed that the only way that they will prevent any more bombing in return, because there's obviously a capability of the Russians to respond, would be if we voluntarily drop a bomb on New York City, which is what we do. And in the beginning of the film, Henry Fonda's wife was going to New York. And so he's dropping a bomb on his own city with his own wife in it as the end of it. So that one, I made the mistake of showing this to my daughters when they were in high school, and they were not the same for several days after that. And then it is a very disturbing movie. It was done again. George Clooney did a live TV production of it in April of 2000, which was a rarity. He has this penchant. There's Clooney is here somewhere in the middle of that picture. Hank Azaria was in it, and I don't remember who else was in it. I think Richard Dreyfuss maybe was in it. But of course, this is in 1964, and if we were to ask what else was happening around October of 1962, it's the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we will be talking about that next time. Now, this one, I want to see, there is another movie here, and I'm going to see if I can show you this one, because this one was a production that the BBC put on, and it was so vivid that it was not allowed to be seen by the British public. So let's see. How do I get to it? All right, wait a minute. I have to go back to my PowerPoint. If you'll just be patient with me a little bit, I want to, this one I would like to have you see if we can at all work it out. All right. No, I don't want to do that. I want to. That's the problem with the Zooms. Okay. All right, now let's see here. Go back. Not seeing it. Well, guess I'm going to have to narrate that one too. This is on a outfit named Vimeo, which does, no, I think, let me give it one more shot here. Just a second. All right, it looks like it's not going to work. Okay, let me tell you about it. It was a film that was produced by the BBC, and it did is everybody with me there? They see the slide that shows the war game. Okay, thank you for that information. At any rate, I had a longer clip of that because it was like our Day After. You remember the Day After that we did in 1987? And I have another clip of that one if I can show it to you. But it was a depiction of a scenario of what would happen in an actual thermonuclear attack. And it created the situation of there being a thermonuclear attack. In Berlin, there was some big problem between the Russians and the Germans, and in any event, the launching of tactical nuclear weapons was authorized, and then of course it escalated. And so Britain gets bombed by a thermonuclear blast. And it shows, well, the clip I was going to show you has a British doctor going around just doing his rounds, and he goes into this home and is looking at this little kid, and he comes out and the sirens go off. And then everybody's trying to get inside and it's just chaos. And of course, then they're going outside to get a kid who's still out there. And there's this huge blast. And he says, don't look at it. And then your eyes are roasted. And it's just really vivid, realistic. And it's horrifically realistic. And that's why the BBC was told, you can't show this. This is too, I mean, it was their own film. And then it was decided that they can't really show it because it would just there'd be a lot of criticism of their showing it. So we go to 1983 when we had The Day After, and this is a panel that had Elie Wiesel in it. And I apologize one more time. It's the last time I'm going to apologize, but I'm so sorry that I can't work this out so that it works, so that you could see some of these things. But Elie Wiesel in this panel, first of all, Jason Robards is in the movie. It's a reenactment, an American produced one this time by ABC, I believe. And then in the aftermath of that, which is also very realistic, it doesn't show you anything pleasant about the actual attack. I remember the scene that I was going to show you in the trailer for it, that shows the people going down the highway, and all of a sudden their cars stop because of the EMF pulse that just kills everything electromagnetic, and they can't get their cars started, they can't do anything, and nobody knows why. But then it shows Jason Robards in his car, and down in the distance, this is in the middle of Kansas someplace, and in the distance you see this mushroom cloud happen, and then the aftermath of the blast hits people and has the same devastating effect. In the aftermath of that, ABC had a panel, knowing that this was going to be really hard for the American public to absorb. And so they had a panel, and it had a number of people on it. They started out with George Shultz, who was Secretary of State at the time, and he assured people that that won't happen because they have put in place deterrence that would, in fact, prevent that from happening. Now, we're going to look at that next week. We're going to be looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then we're going to be looking at the SALT I Treaty and SALT II Treaty, and ask about the SALT III, which is coming up for renewal, like in 2 days, it seems to me. And the question there is, can we actually prevent something like this by means of political negotiations? And so that will be our topic for next week. But right now, this panel had Elie Wiesel on it. And I remember vividly seeing him, because I watched this back in 1983, and I imagine some of you did too. But Elie Wiesel said, they asked him for his perception of the whole situation. He said, what he knows is that we can have madness in history. He said, we have already had one kind of madness. And of course, he knew that well, being in the Holocaust himself. And he knows that that madness can happen. And he's thought that this was another kind of madness, but it has happened. We could have it happen. So I remember being very impressed by his statement to that effect. Another member of the panel was Carl Sagan, and Sagan's comments were, of course, oriented toward the climate impact of these nuclear blasts, of a thermonuclear war. If we ever have a thermonuclear exchange, it's going to produce a nuclear winter and likely kill all life on Earth eventually, because of the nuclear winter that's produced by the radiation in the cloud that comes up and blocks sunlight and kills life on Earth. That's plant life, and then we're going to go the way of the dinosaur, essentially. So the stakes have gone up enormously, and the public is learning about this. So there's been many other films and books about the nuclear Holocaust than those I've mentioned, and I suspect some of you will be able to bring them up. And I have a list of those too, but I don't trust myself to get it to you without too much trouble here. And so what we're going to do, we'll look at how these real historical events, have exacerbated public anxiety, because it's not only this, it's not only the fact that we could have a nuclear Holocaust, but it's also the accidental possibilities of our attempts to use nuclear power peacefully. In other words, by this time, we have the, nuclear reactors all over the place, but they're not necessarily completely safe. So what we'll do in the last session, and that one I've designated as more of a discussion, then I will give you 3 summary statements about the 3 major accidents that we've had, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. And then we'll talk about the problem that that gives us on the one hand, and on the other hand, this enormously growing demand for more and more energy and on the world's part, and how are we going to avoid using nuclear energy? So that's a topic that I will be drawing on the wisdom of all of you, as well as giving you some information at the beginning. But this is a little bit of a shorter session today because this technology that I was hoping to work, I haven't mastered how you do that sufficiently to be able to do it. So I'm going to stop there and elicit comments from you. If you have any comments that you'd like to make, or if you have some questions, I might be able to answer some of those, but I'll stop here at any rate. So John, I'll turn it back to you, or Lance, whoever.
Yeah, so we'll throw it to John first. Any insights he has to share?
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'll use my prerogative to ask first a question and then a comment. My question is about the Radium Girls. Was the kind of cancers that they get mostly in the mouth, or was it spread throughout the body? Do you remember?
Now, you froze up a little on me there, and I'm sure I've frozen up on some of you somewhere along the line too. I didn't get the whole question, John. Would you repeat it, please?
My question was about the Radium Girls, who put the tips of the radium pens in their mouth.
Right.
Were the cancers that they died of mostly cancers of the mouth?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's the ones I've heard of. That's the ones they show. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I don't know whether it was other than that or not. And like I said, the people knew, the military knew, because even in the testing of the thermonuclear bombs, they knew that they had designated a process of, you get exposed, you need to get washed down immediately. And, so they knew that they had some trouble. And of course, if you saw the movie with, I've forgotten the name of it, it was about Manhattan Project. And they had an experiment that they did in Los Alamos, in which you dropped a certain amount of uranium, and they called it tickling the dragon or something like that. And something went awry, and one kind of heroic person rushed in and grabbed it and took it away. So that was depicted in that movie about what happened at Manhattan Project. Now, with a movie, you always don't know exactly how accurately something is being depicted, or whether it's a dramatic device, right? And so, but I think there was awareness that we're playing with fire here from radiation as well as explosions. So yes, and they would have various bodily effects. And of course, they're learning about this, right? They're learning what happens when you get exposed.
One other comment that I'll make, and then we'll turn to everyone else who has their hands up. When I was, I guess, in junior high school, or maybe the first year in high school, so this would have been in the late 40s. I grew up in Colorado, and there was an abandoned uranium mine in Colorado that people paid to go down and breathe the healthy radon in those caves. I remember that very, very vividly, and wondering, does this really make sense? And of course, as I got a little bit older, I realized that it was a crazy thing. But we had to learn about the dangers of radiation.
Yeah, well,
okay.
that let me just make a comment on that, if you wouldn't mind. That is a colleague of mine, a historian of science in New York University. He wrote a book a number of years ago now called Nuclear Fear, which is available. And in that, he portrays that we do have an irrational fear of nuclear science or nuclear matters. So much so that you kind of hear the public has a toleration for, they want zero radiation. Well, that's not possible. I mean, we have a lot of natural radiation. And I remember hearing a lecture from a fellow who was in the medical field, and he was saying that that evolution has produced us to have a certain need for a certain degree of radiation. All right. Now, I don't remember how that all went, although he did cite some experiments in which people from higher altitudes who are exposed to more radiation had less cancers of certain type than people at lower latitudes because they didn't get as much radiation. And so a certain amount of, it's like anything else. If you have too little or too much, it's not good. And the amount that we need apparently is not that much. But the point is that if you have this nuclear fear to the degree that you demand zero, that's not, first of all, it's not possible. And secondly, it's being a bit irrational. We need to not fear it so much as that. All right, let's keep going here.
I do agree with that. And I think that is going to be a problem as we try to develop nuclear power to replace some of the coal, and much more dangerous, I think, in my view.
Yeah.
Many more people die of the effects of coal. So anyway, let's see. I'm gonna turn that back over to you, Lance, to let you handle further questions.
You know, if you have any kind of sense of a chronology of questions there.
So I see a bunch of hands raised, but first we had a comment come in, a question through that. Keith Berg said that they have a comment on grade school attempts to prepare for nuclear bombs that they wanted to share. That came in first.
Hi, can you hear me yet?
Yes, we can hear you.
My comment has to do with my memory of being in grade school, which for me would have been in the early 50s. I think it was in grade school, quote, preparing for nuclear attacks by crouching under our desks.
Yes, duck and cover.
Of course, in reality is silly. But the fact that they even was done says a lot about how poorly we understood what this was all about at the time, or at least desperate to make such a silly suggestion.
Yeah, no, I agree. I guess it was an attempt to do something. And of course, it was a waste of time.
All right, great. Thank you. Next up, we have Shirley Bloodworth. I can see you have your hand raised.
Yes, I just wanted to comment, Fred, that I have been to Nagasaki, and they have a peace park there at the center of supposedly where the bomb hit, with a museum with pictures that will just tear your heart out. And they have a huge statue of a boy and a girl holding hands, but it's empty. It is just the outline of both of the characters. And it is so moving. It is really moving. And just crazy to think of the devastation when you go through the museum. And I said something to the tour guide. I said, gee, we really did terrible damage to innocent people. And I guess she was trained to answer the company line. She said, well, Japan wasn't very nice either. So we dismissed it at that, but it was a very emotional visit to a museum, I can tell you.
Thank you for sharing that. Next up, we have a chat question from Bob Bernstein, and it reads, wouldn't a horrific film like The War Game have been useful for making us all so horrified that we would all want to avoid such a Holocaust?
Well, that kind of question is very difficult to analyze. And the reason I say that is because there were a number of scientists who, at the time, who figured that they justified their involvement because they firmly believed that if they were successful in producing an atomic bomb, it would be so horrible that people would outlaw war and they would not utilize war. They would realize that this is impossible. And we go from there to deterrence, right? Which is this two-sided thing. You build a bomb in order not to use it. That's your goal. You do not want to use it, but you figure you have to have it, and you have to have the other side believe you will use it. And so we quickly leave the idea that something is so horrific that would never do because it's so outlandish that people would know better, into a reality that's putting you on a different level, even to this meta reality of we're in a game that we don't want to play. And that's what happens. So yeah, one would think that, but we get carried along with our decisions into a different ball game. And then we're in that ball game and there's no choice but to play. Now, having said all that, the comeback, if that is a criticism, the comeback to that criticism is it has worked to this point. George Shultz was right up to now. And then there are people that say the game is not over yet. We could still unleash these things. So we keep playing this game, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. The next person I see who has a hand raised is I'm so sorry if I mispronounced your last name, Elie Wiesel.
Yeah.
Good morning, Izzy. Good morning,
Elie,
Izzy.
thank you, Fred, for such a great talk. Some of us here today were in our Thursday group 10 or 15 years ago, and I don't remember exactly when, but we had Rhoda Swirlick's late husband was in our group, and we were discussing the use of the bomb in Japan, and he was totally for it. And because his point of view was that he was on a ship headed to Japan to land in Japan and fight the war there. And had the atomic bomb not been dropped, he might have been killed in Japan. I see Shirley is nodding that she remembers that. So that was another point of view.
Yeah, that's Truman. That's what Truman said too. So it was exactly the same point, which is hard to deny. I mean, that probably could have happened.
Next up, we have a comment in the chat from Eli Glazer, and it reads, do you have a comment on real incidents in recent history that came close to a nuclear incident?
Well, there have been a number of lost bombs that have gone astray and were live. There's one famous one off the coast of Spain back in, I don't remember what part of the late 60s, I think. So there's been a number of those. And I think we came closer in the Cuban Missile Crisis than many people think. And then in the 80s, in the early 80s, when Ronald Reagan was president, the Soviets came very close to initiating a first strike under some false information. And it wasn't very well publicized. And I'm just trying to remember a little bit more about it. So there have been incidents in which we've come close. Most of them have not gotten wide public, they haven't been publicized widely. And so most people don't realize that that's happened. And again, I don't know exactly how to measure how close we came. One knows that if anything had gone awry, we were in a situation at any rate, that if it had tipped a little more, it could have been disastrous.
Up next, we have Ken Burns, who's raising their hand.
Okay, thank you, Lance. A couple of brief points. One is the radium that the women licked tends to get taken up into the bone marrow. And so that causes all sorts of problems. Secondly, Dr. Strangelove, of course, was a takeoff on Kissinger. And one of the reasons that Kissinger got a really evil reputation was that he wrote a book called Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, which I think you may have cited there. And in that book,
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
he simply outlined the tactics and strategy for using tactical nuclear weapons with the ability not to go to the big ones. But most people didn't buy into his argument well. So that was one of the real issues. Also, the fear of radiation. We could almost, I don't know totally, but we could do a terrific job of knocking down food poisoning in this country if we simply irradiated our food. There's no radiation hazard associated with this, but public fear is such that nobody dares to do it. And so we pay the price of another 10,000 cases of food poisoning in the country every year as a consequence. So I think all of these things fit well with what you were saying. I think the one incident in the 80s was that the reason the Russians got bad information, the story I heard, was that there was a Russian officer whose job it was to press the button and respond. And he had sufficient doubts about the validity of the information he was getting not to do it.
Yeah.
And that's how a terrible situation was prevented.
Right. Yeah, that sounds right now that you mention it. There was in the movie Failsafe, Walter Matthau played this character, and I believe it was Herman Kahn, if I'm not mistaken, who wrote a book on thermonuclear war, in which he argued for a limited thermonuclear war. You could have a limited thermonuclear war. And his basic position was, the Russians are so bad. Now, I've got to check to see if it's actually Herman Kahn. I was just doing that on my phone here. But position was, we will have huge casualties, but we need to launch a first strike against Russia because we have the opportunity here to eliminate communism. That was his point. And if we eliminate communism and start over, yes, we will lose millions of lives, but we'll start over. And he was making that case to the president in the film. And so, and that actually was the position of some people, as you can imagine.
I think he was with the Hudson Institute. And I think it was.
Yeah, well, let me check, because I don't want to saddle him with something that he didn't do.
He had plenty.
Yeah.
Can I comment now?
No, because you got to get one.
In the meantime, is it okay if I call on, it's almost 11, but we have 3 last people raising hands, if that's okay to do those 3 people.
Those 3, that's good.
Okay, great. So just as a heads up for everyone, the last 3 people will be Alice Gridley, and then Rick Gold, and then we'll end on Doe Brown, just so everyone's clear of what's about to happen. So Alice Gridley, you are up.
We can't hear you, Alice.
You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk today. You really reminded me of a situation that happened when I was very young. It was in the late 1940s. My aunt, Nina Greenlaw, worked at the Waltham watch factory in Massachusetts. And she was one of the people that was affected by radium because of the work she was doing on the line. And all I remember as a child, I don't recall any of the details, but the only thing that impressed me at the time was that it was terminal. There was no antidote for what she went through. And so I appreciate your talk today.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you.
I did check. It was Herman Kahn who wrote on thermonuclear war.
Up next, we have Rick Gold.
Hi, Fred.
Hi, Rick.
The
Manhattan Project was developed as a race against Germany to develop the atomic bomb. But of course, it was actually used on Japan. But all of the efforts by governments to deal with these issues seem to encourage a public opinion in support of US use of the nuclear weapons. And I was wondering, to what degree in the literature and the films did you see different countries as being villainized as the targets? Germany, Japan, the Soviet Union, and elsewhere in the literature.
Yeah, the villains are, of course, the people who attacked us at Pearl Harbor. That's the big villain, and justifying the use of the bomb in Japan. And I remember as a child, and maybe you guys do too, people using the word Japs without any hesitation. Harry Truman uses that word occasionally. And so that was a clear villain. The Soviets have always been a villain in the communist era. Certainly McCarthy made it even more so in the aftermath of the 50s. But so those are the two major villains. And those are often the two that are talked about in the context of the use of nuclear weapons. After that, it degenerates into an analysis. And the thing that I guess I find disturbing, and I suspect we all do, is that the analysis seems to be carried out as if it were dispassionate. That is, when can we use tactical? Could we use tactical weapons? Now, tactical weapon is a weapon that is used in a local area, so to speak, as opposed to a strategic weapon, which is the development of ICBMs that can deliver it continent to continent. And I'll talk more about that next week. But you know, that's kind of a dispassionate analysis. In fact, I remember reading one person just mentioned casualty offhand, that it was his opinion that the US military went on and carried on with the development of nuclear weapons because they're cheap, they're very efficient in comparison, that you can get a lot of bang for your buck, literally, but also that they're very effective. And so the cost was involved. You know, I find that not something that should be the determining factor of a discussion like this. So, you know, it moves after the immediate villains to a different level. And it's a kind of a military strategic question. And sometimes that level can eliminate or at least ignore kind of issues and concerns that all of us would hope would accompany any kind of possible discussion about using nuclear weapons. So I don't know if that did get everything you were implying, Rick, but that would be my initial response.
Okay, great. And then the last person will be Doe Brown.
Thank you. I don't see any reason to think that we would not have had a nuclear arms race or a Cold War if we had not used our bombs to end World War II. We can't say that no other country would have ever developed a nuclear weapon. Am I missing something, Fred?
No, you're not. You're not missing anything there. Yeah, I think that's perfectly correct. In fact, we mentioned Klaus Fuchs. Klaus Fuchs was the guy who betrayed our secret to the Russians. He was a pacifist. He did it because he believed it would outlaw war. And as I said, that was a very naive point of view, which became very clear in the aftermath, but that was his motivation. And so I think the research that was forced by the military, it's a good question, but I have to think you're probably right, that eventually science would have realized the power of the nucleus. And then it would have been irresistible on the part of somebody somewhere to recognize the potential it had for military use. So I think you're right. Now, there were a number of initiatives in the 40s even, and then on in the 50s, and there still are initiatives, and we're going to be facing one right now, this week, with the reinitiation of the START Treaty, in which people are trying to keep a lid on these things. And even at the very beginning, the Baruch Plan in the 40s, which was a plan to try and control the development of atomic energy. And that was one that ran into the problems that you face when you don't have people that are willing to exert any kind of trust in the other. And that's always a question. How do you behave responsibly based on trust when you could be naive, and with the stakes being as high as they are? That's the problem you have. And so it failed. Now, Eisenhower, of course, had the program on Atoms for Peace, which was the development of nuclear energy. And that's another question we'll get to in the last session. But it is possible that when you develop science, you can get these tremendous benefits too. So we don't live in a simplistic world.
Thank you. And thanks for this great lecture.
Well, I'm sorry that we didn't have, well, it worked out for the best, but I'll be glad to, and you don't have, but I'd be glad to supply anybody with the links for the trailers to that British production if you want to see it, and any of the other links that I had there the day after, and the panel, all of that. That's not hard to get, but I have it. So if you want it, just email me. And I think Julie has, and I know John has my email. So feel free.
Okay, thank you, Fred, for this lecture. And we're looking forward to the answer of the question of your next lecture. Is politics capable of containing the threat to life on Earth? We would really like to know what the answer is.
Yes, I would too, but I will try and discuss it. All right, thanks, folks.